This is working. Hello? Okay. I think you can see me. Let me know in the chat if you can. So sorry we had so many technical difficulties, but I'm glad to be here now. Yeah, I guess I'll introduce myself. I'm Tia Wilson, and I'm an OCD advocate. So I've had OCD since I was 3 years old, but I wasn't diagnosed until 2 years ago, and that's when I started treatment. Went from clinically severe to clinically mild. And now I just kind of share my story online. And so, yeah, I'm super excited to be here and be sharing all this with you. Um, so, yeah, if anyone has any questions, we can dive right in. This is just kind of general OCD questions, living with OCD, what it looks like in recovery, different questions about different themes. I'm open to anything. While we wait for that, if you guys are wanting to know more about the advocacy work I do a lot of it over on Instagram at Tortilla Wilson. You can see a lot of just general awareness is kind of what I do. I just share my story. I talk about what OCD can look like for different people. And I do that in the form of, like silly reels and sometimes more informative, like sit down chats. I also do podcasting where you could hear some of that as well. But my handle is at Tortilla Wilson if you want to check that out. I'm just going to double check that you guys can see me. Let me see if I can log on from my phone. And if anyone is there and wants to message in the chat, then I can know that you're listening so that I can make sure this is going live. We had so many problems.
I'm here.
Oh, hello.
So I could see you, but I don't know if you can see the comments.
I can't. Oh, now I can. Oh, lovely.
It's just like it's like my magic touch, I guess.
Yes, thank you. Okay, I think I'm good.
Hi guys, I'm also here. My son is getting a bath. My mother-in-law is here. I'm clearly not dressed for the occasion. I was going to have Tia do this, but
well, I think
to be here so that you can see the comments.
I think I might be able to see them even if you leave now.
Can you? Okay, I'm gonna try.
I think so. Okay, we'll see.
I'm here, so if you need me.
Okay, I'll let you know.
Can you see my little comment that says you're live?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, guys. So if you have any questions, leave them here for Tia. But Tia, I'm here if you need anything.
Sounds great. Thanks, Jenna.
You can tell them about your support groups too. We go live in 2 hours, you guys, with a brand new support group dealing with mental compulsions. So I'm excited for that one.
That'll be awesome. Yeah, that one's at 9 p.m. CST. If you guys want to tune in, it's mental compulsions, kind of pure O, all of that stuff. Awesome. It's going to be really fun. Okay, we'll see ya. Okay, someone says they experience false memory OCD and have been trying to accept the uncertainty and discomfort, but it's really difficult. That is really difficult. False memory OCD is tricky because it is having you question reality, right? It's having you question the things that you've done in the past, and it can be really scary when you aren't able to get certainty with it. Sitting with that uncertainty is really, really hard. Any tips that can help you do that? I mean, it's kind of the same as all the themes. As you lean into the uncertainty, some of that distress will probably start to subside a little bit, and you'll be more comfortable sitting with it. It's definitely not an easy one to sit with, though, and sometimes it's helpful to talk about it with other people to try to kind of release a little bit of the shame that comes along with it. Talking about how difficult it is and asking for support in a way that's not them giving you reassurance, but just validating what you're going through, I think can be a really powerful tool. So that's another place that support groups can be really, really incredible because you're able to, be validated and sit with other people who are also experiencing it, which can make it just a little bit easier to kind of go through that. That's a really good question. Thank you. Someone says, my daughter can't function at school. She's 11 years old. It's gotten so bad that she can't Google or email message as she has a fear of things being there forever and won't take any medication. Any suggestions? It's so tricky when it's kids, especially because the nature of OCD therapy means the person getting therapy needs to be self-advocating for it. Otherwise, it's not going to do anything. Exposure therapy is not just, showing up and doing exposures. It's an internal process where you're letting yourself face those things without neutralizing in other ways. And so it's really tricky with kids because they might not have, the insight and discernment to be able to advocate when they need those things, like when they need to go to therapy or when they need medication. I think a really powerful tool there is kind of the same as the person experiencing the false memory OCD. It's helping her be able to feel a little validated in what she's going through. And that can come in many ways. So, I mean, a lot of times I have moms message me on Instagram and I'll send a little video to their kid, just kind of expressing my support and some of the things that I've gone through, because that piece about, getting rid of some of that shame and some of that judgment is super, super important, and especially for kids. If there's any support groups for children in your area, that can be a really good intro in the door. Um, and I think that's one where even if you're going to therapy as a parent, and seeking to understand what she's going through, that will help, even if it feels like it's not, because you'll be able to at least change your responses to her. Um, Emily asks, why does OCD feel so real? And like the thoughts are my reality. Right? That's one of the hardest things about OCD is it feels so infused with your everyday way of thinking. It's really important to remember that OCD is ego dystonic, meaning it goes against your values. The things that are coming up aren't aligning with your values, but they definitely feel like they are when they're coming up that frequently. That's another piece where the psychoeducation can come in handy, kind of understanding where these thoughts are coming from, understanding OCD a little bit, can help make them feel a little bit less threatening. But another piece of it is leaning into that, leaning into the fact that this does feel real. Maybe this is what I actually believe. Maybe these are my real thoughts. Maybe this is reality. And that's a really scary and hard thing to do, but there's a lot of relief that can come from leaning into that uncertainty. Someone says, okay, no CD is saying, so probably Jenna, that they read about my trauma versus OCD research and reading lately on Instagram and want me to talk a little bit about it. Yeah, so I've been researching a lot of the differences between PTSD and OCD in terms of treatment because I deal with both of them. And they're super distinct because OCD, you have a trigger and you lean into it and you know, just go all in. You're doing a hierarchy to expose yourself to it. And with trauma work, you have to do things a lot more gently. When you're doing an exposure with OCD, you can tell when it's too big of an exposure for you because you have the urge to do other compulsions, and that means you have to do a hierarchy to build up to it. But with trauma, the way you tell if it's too much for you is different. You do have to rely on your feelings of distress and find that window of tolerance where you can, be sitting with the distress in a way that's not causing you to flood or experience more trauma. And so that's something I've been talking about over on Instagram is the differences between OCD and trauma therapy. And I just encourage anyone who is dealing with both trauma and OCD to choose the one that's affecting them the most, work with your therapist to choose the one that's affecting you most and start there, start kind of diving right into that. And then later you can, if you're choosing to focus on the OCD, focus on the OCD, and then later you can add in the trauma work. But doing both at once just isn't conducive to healing because you approach them so differently. So yeah, if you're interested in learning more, go to my Instagram at Tortilla Wilson and we can talk about that more. Okay, we have some questions about ROCD here. Someone says they have ROCD that tells them that their relationship with their fiance is doomed to fail. Another person is saying they really like this guy and can't stop thinking about asking him out for coffee, but get confused whether it's OCD or really wanting to ask him out logically. So let's kind of dive into both of those. Both of those fall into the relationship OCD, ROCD theme. And they're tricky, right? It's hard when it's something you care about so much, like your fiance or like a relationship. I think it's really natural as humans for that to be a priority, to want to foster healthy and good relationships, right? And so it can be really tricky when that's what OCD is grabbing onto. So I think the first piece I would say is to have self-compassion with it. Acknowledge that that's hard. Acknowledge that it's something you care about, that this is an important thing for you, and that's why it's hard. And then, for the person asking about this guy who they want to ask him out to coffee and you're not sure if it's OCD or really wanting to ask him out, take the risk, whether that's asking him out or not asking him out, whichever one feels like a risk, do it. So it's really easy for us to want to kind of dissect what is and what isn't OCD. Do I actually care about this person, or is this coming from, this place of OCD? But at the end of the day, you could bounce back and forth between the two forever and ever, and all you're doing is reinforcing that cycle that OCD loves to put you through, which is having a fear, engaging in a compulsion, neutralizing that fear, and then doing it all again. And that cycle just reinforces that there's fear there. And so I'd encourage you to make a decision, quick and reckless. Just, whether that's asking him out or not, flip a coin maybe, and then go for it. I think one thing I like to do in those scenarios is just think about which one sounds like a little bit more of a risk to me. So whether that is or whether that isn't asking him out. And then face it, try it. And again, validate that it's a hard one to deal with, but I'd encourage you to really push yourself to make some steps in the direction of risk. And as for this person talking about the ROCD saying their loving relationship with their fiance is doomed to fail, tricky. That one's really hard, especially when you are engaged and you feel like this is going to be a big step in your life and you want to make sure you're, you know, making the right decision. That's a really, really common time for OCD to grab onto relationships, especially just because of all the stress of being engaged. You're having to merge your life. There's already that natural stress, and it's usually a good stress, but it can definitely kind of spur your OCD along. So that's a really tricky one. Again, I'd encourage you to just validate that it's hard, that this is something that's important to you, and take some of those again steps toward risk, like I encouraged Elizabeth to do. Just kind of take being along for the ride, going and picking out things for a wedding, or doing those little exposure steps. A therapist can help you to make a hierarchy that includes some of those wedding planning things that might feel stressful. But all of those are opportunities to do exposures and kind of expose yourself to these things, while again making sure you're validating. But it's tricky. It really is. Let's see. Oh, so Elizabeth is also asking, because I have harm OCD, and if I want to ask this guy out, does it make me want to kill my mother? Yeah, so oftentimes when that thinking is kind of following this pattern that looks a little illogical, that often means it's a sign that maybe it is OCD. But I think a really key point here is you could fight all day trying to decide whether something is or isn't OCD. But at the end of the day, that's just encouraging the OCD cycle. So embracing the uncertainty there. Okay, Charlotte is saying, I know online you've mentioned existential themes in the past. Can you talk a little bit about your experience with this, and specifically what some of your exposures were to face your fears with this? Ooh, okay, existential OCD is gnarly. I experienced it kind of forever. It's always been a theme of mine. It really closely coincided with, oh, sorry, I'm reading it at the same time I'm talking and I keep getting distracted. It really closely coincided with my scrupulosity OCD. And so that was religious OCD for me. I was really concerned about religion, and that meshed really horribly with the existential OCD. And I had a lot of questions about afterlife and a lot of religious existential questions. That had always been a theme for me, but it got particularly bad when I moved to Hawaii. And living out there, I didn't have any friends or family out there with me. Everything was unfamiliar. The people were unfamiliar. The air felt different. I'm used to dry Utah air. And so going to Hawaii, where it was all like humid, everything felt different. It felt very surreal. And that's when a lot of the existential OCD came out for me. And I found myself just lingering on these questions. And the difference between someone who just thinks about existential questions, and someone who has existential OCD is typically, if someone has an existential question, they can think through it. They can go and have a discussion with friends and think through it and leave not knowing any more answers than they went into that discussion with, and be okay with that. they're okay not knowing the answers. It's fun to talk about. It's interesting to talk about. I think most people probably worry about it to a certain extent, but usually they're okay accepting the fact that they can't know those answers, in life because they're too big. They're questions like, is reality real? Am I real? Am I a figment of my own imagination? What happens after you die? All those really big questions that everyone has. But with existential OCD, it feels like you're not okay not knowing the answer. It feels like you have to figure it out now. It's this urgent, pressing thing you need to figure out right this second. And you just can't, right? And so then your OCD grabs onto it and will try to make you figure it out. And you'll just sit there and you'll loop through these questions because there's no real answers. It's not a forward progression of thought, it's just looping. And that can be really, really hard. And it can be really isolating because you are feeling like you're just carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. It feels so urgent that you figure these things out when you can't. And so yeah, with the existential OCD, it can feel really heavy and really lonely, because since you're interfacing with such big questions, you might find yourself kind of isolating from society a little bit. It feels like everyday tasks like going to work feel so mundane in comparison to these big questions. So you might find yourself pulling away from people because you have bigger fish to fry. You got to figure out if life is real. You don't have time to go bowling. Like, you can find yourself kind of isolating, which just kind of adds to that feeling of isolation and or of loneliness. And so that was kind of my experience with it. It was really, really tricky. I found it just was heavy. I think heavy is the best word I can describe it as. What those exposures looked like, a lot of it was, doing some of those things that brought up those questions and not letting myself engage in mental compulsions. Um, because predominantly existential OCD has a lot of mental compulsions, right? And so it was going into situations I knew would trigger that existential OCD and then not letting myself, talk myself out of it. So going to church and then sitting with those questions and not ruminating on them, not doing that cycle. Talking with friends about existential things and not letting myself ruminate on it, just getting more comfortable with the idea that I couldn't know. And it also looked like stopping Googling. I wasn't Googling or looking for answers, all those ways I used to try to seek those answers. I kind of had to take a break from. So sometimes it was taking a break from those discussions. A lot of those exposures looked more like finding ways to get out of the mental compulsions I was doing. So if existential OCD is something you're struggling with, there might be something for you in this group we're doing later tonight at 9 p.m. CST. If you want to join us in that group, it's all about mental compulsions. Um, Love Lana is saying, when people refer to relationship themed OCD, is that romantic relationships? It can be, and predominantly that's what we're seeing in these. When we do like a relationship OCD group, we tend to see people who are dealing with it in regards to romantic relationship. That's definitely not the only way it can show up. It can show up in a myriad of ways. So for me, it showed up when I was really little toward my dad. I just didn't know that I could trust him. I was over analyzing everything he did, doing a lot of mental compulsions, doing a lot of tests to make sure like he truly loved me. And that can happen too. It can be a parent-child relationship. It can be siblings. It can be, friends. It can really coworkers. It can extend to anything. And so, yeah, it doesn't just have to be a romantic relationship, but that is something that a lot of people tend to find it focusing on because of how much we all want romantic relationships, of how important that is to so many people. Let's see. Oh yeah, Solana's also saying that in terms of the existential OCD, they got obsessed with the concept of nothing. The compulsion was repeatedly trying to understand and see the concept in my mind's eye. It was so frustrating. Yeah, that's a really good example of existential OCD. I got really obsessed with the idea of eternity because that was something that was talked about in my church, was this eternal, ongoing, ever-present life. And I didn't know what to do with that. I didn't know what eternity meant. I really would focus on that. And yeah, that was really tricky. Okay. No CD's asking again, what were the biggest lessons or teachings you learned in treatment? Any light bulb or aha moments? Yeah. Um, I think one of the biggest ones for me was doing a lot of exposures in regards to scrupulosity OCD. So, scrupulosity for me, like I mentioned earlier, had a lot to do with my religion. And I had taken all these religious rules and taken them to an extreme. So one thing we talk about in my religion is, like having appropriate speech, not swearing. And my scrupulosity had taken that to an extreme that was like, if I ever swore, I would go directly to like the pits of hell. There would be no redemption and God would never love me. And I didn't believe that for other people, which is how you know it's OCD. It's just about me. I thought if other people swore, they'd be fine, but me, oh, never. And so one of my biggest exposures was doing swearing exposures. They'd have me start off writing swear words, and I'd be writing them really teeny tiny and whispering, and then a little bigger and a little bigger until I was outside yelling them, yelling the worst words I could think of. And it was as I was yelling them, doing this thing that just felt so viscerally terrifying. I felt like I'd again go straight to hell. It felt like as I was yelling these things, I was being sent straight there. I was just signing the like my signature on my condemnation. It felt so real. Um, and as I was out there feeling that intense, 10 out of 10 distress and then watching it go down, there's this moment where I just felt like relief. And I just felt this understanding. Um, and it changed my whole relationship with religion. It changed my relationship with my OCD. And it was just this moment where I had conquered what was, I mean, it sounds so silly, right? I was just swearing, but that was my biggest fear. And as I conquered that fear, I just felt this new resolve, and just so much love, so much self compassion, um, and so much gratitude. It was all encompassing. And I think that that is one of the things. Exposure therapy is so hard, but that was one of the moments that made it all worth it for me because it was this complete understanding and complete self compassion. Um, while I faced my biggest fear. So, just those of you who are in exposure therapy, just want to send a huge shout out to you because it's hard. It's hard work, but you're showing up for yourself. And I hope that you're able to extend yourself that compassion and that grace because you're doing it. You're facing your fears. Who else goes out there and is like, "Oh, I'm going to go to therapy today and just face my biggest fear." That's not the thing most people wake up in the morning and do, but that's what those of you who are, facing ERP are doing. You're facing your biggest fears. And so just a huge kudos for that. I think that was one of the biggest aha moments I had. Um, and yeah, I love seeing people in the chat supporting each other. Yeah, Lana saying, yes, it's okay if someone else does it. Of course they're forgivable. Yeah, that's something that's so interesting about OCD is it is always so compassionate about other people. I've noticed a lot in the community, these people who have OCD are so kind and so willing to give other people the benefit of the doubt, but never themselves. It's so different. It has a lot to do with the rules you impose on yourself, not the rules you impose on other people. That's a trademark characteristic of OCD. It's super interesting. And yeah, I just love seeing that you guys are supporting each other in the chat. That's so cool to me. I think another lesson I had in treatment was the day I decided I would not use my OCD as a crutch. Um, I think beforehand I thought about diagnosis as this thing that you would do, to get a label that you could fall back on. It was kind of like an excuse to live however you wanted to. And I didn't like that idea. And so I vowed that I wouldn't use my OCD that way. I wouldn't use my diagnosis of OCD as a crutch. And I'm so grateful I did because I think that made all of the difference. Because from that point on, I never did. It was very much, the label became empowering to me. It was a label that helped me understand the way I was thinking so I could change it, right? It was a label that helped me notice the areas of my life that I hadn't been doing very well at confronting and the areas of my life where I had, um, I guess, I don't know. The areas of my life that I needed to work on, and then it gave me the tools to be able to work on them. Because beforehand, I had so many things I just wasn't able to do. I wasn't able to clean my room and I couldn't figure out why. I wasn't able, all of these different things. And so it was really powerful for me to be able to have the label of OCD because then it gave me a place to go to look to fix those things, right? It helped me show up in those areas of my life and be like, okay, I do want to clean my room and I haven't been able to. Now that I have this label of OCD, I can figure out how to get better from it. It gave me just like actionable steps toward growth. And so I think a lot of people are nervous about getting the diagnosis because they don't want to, you know, take it on as a crutch or as an excuse. But I think an aha moment I had in therapy was the day I decided I wouldn't do that. And I don't think most people with OCD do. Most of us are really wanting to own up to the parts that are us and the parts that are OCD. But it was really powerful for me to recognize it as an opportunity to learn more and to grow more and not as something that held me back. So if you're hesitant about getting the diagnosis, I'd encourage you to look into it because it will give you, the ability to figure out how to show up in those areas that you want to show up in. Let's see. Yeah, I suffer with existential OCD, thinking the world isn't real, and my OCD is constantly telling me I have a different disorder, such as schizophrenia or psychosis. Are there exposures for these thoughts? So yeah, thank you, Alyssa. Yeah, there definitely are. I think a really powerful one for this is doing imaginary scripts. So writing out your biggest fear that maybe you were just misdiagnosed. What would that look like? The worst case scenario, and then sitting with the distress of it, reading through it, and just sitting there, not letting yourself neutralize those feelings. Um, Talking to other people who have been misdiagnosed. And all of these, I would say, be super wary that you're not just, going haphazardly into an exposure, but you're bringing it up with a therapist and making sure you do it in a way that's, trauma informed, because unfortunately, a lot of us with OCD have been misdiagnosed in the past, which is why a lot of us have that fear. While OCD fears can be about anything, it doesn't have to be about a past experience. A lot of us have been misdiagnosed in the past before we got diagnosed with OCD. And so it can also play into a trauma place there. So I'd encourage you to talk with a therapist about how to do that in a way that's trauma informed if that's something you've dealt with. But imaginary scripts are really, really incredible for those things because you can write out your biggest fear of being misdiagnosed and then sit with the distress of it. Advice for a backdoor spike. I'm going through one now. Ooh, okay, backdoor spikes are pretty tricky. That often happens when, I'm trying to think the best way to describe it. You've gone through exposure therapy, and it kind of just, wow, I'm having a hard time describing it. Who wants to describe it for me? The backdoor spike, my goodness. I'm a little flustered. I actually, right before I got on here, had my ribs just relocated, and it was very painful, and I'm still a little out of it. Why can't I not remember what the backdoor spike is? I started talking about it, and then I completely forgot. So Emily, if you want to remind me what that is, I would love to talk about it more. And again, I'm loving seeing everyone in this chat all talking about it, and supporting each other. Yeah, there's so many good questions. Let me make sure I'm not missing any. Okay, someone's saying, are tantrums a symptom of not giving in to OCD compulsions? If OCD tells me to do something, if OCD tells me something needs to happen and it doesn't, I throw an annoying and embarrassing fit. I hate it so much. Yeah, I think especially at the beginning, what you're doing essentially is your brain has created this canyon. It's like it's forged this way for how you deal with your uncertainty in life, right? It's created a canyon by putting so much water down this road the same way. This is a poor example, but you know how canyons are created with lots of water. And now when you're going through exposure therapy, you're rerouting that water to this little teeny groove you've made over here. And so your brain's like, what are you doing? Like, we have this whole beautiful canyon you've been making for years. Why on earth are you like redirecting all of this water to this little garbage groove you've made? And it's because you're rewiring the way your brain works, right? And it's intentionally every single day you have to, reroute this water, right? And it's so tricky. And in that process of rewiring, it's super frustrating. You're using so much of your emotional energy, right? Like you're just giving it your all to reroute this water every day. And so it's really, really normal for you to have a reaction to that of just like distress. Um, and I, for one, when I was going through exposure therapy, just felt completely emotionally exhausted. I felt like I didn't have any energy to regulate the way I handled situations anymore. And so I would often find myself having tantrums or just like meltdowns that felt really extreme to me. But just practice self compassion with it, acknowledge the place that you're in. Um, Obviously, it's still not appropriate for those tantrums to be inflicted on someone else or to, be harming someone else. But have self-compassion when you're having a meltdown because you're doing so much work to reroute this little pathway. And so it's really normal to feel that burnout. And yes, Emily. Okay, Emily reminded me, of course, it's when an OCD sufferer starts to experience less anxiety in response to their unwanted thoughts. So yeah, when you have some sort of intrusive thoughts and you're doing exposures with them and sitting with them, and then suddenly your distress starts going down, you start to worry, oh my gosh, maybe I liked that thought. Like maybe I've gotten to a place where I'm liking this thought now because the distress kind of serves in a really odd way as reassurance, right? It helps you know, okay, I don't actually want these thoughts because I feel so scared of them. But then you stop feeling scared of them. It is really common for OCD sufferers to have this little, they call the backdoor spike, where it's just this, oh my gosh, like, what have I done? What if I actually like these thoughts now because I don't feel this fear anymore? Um, and it's really tricky and really common. So I think one of the things I would encourage you to remember is that it's really common. That a lot of us go through that. I definitely did, and just have that self-compassion of, okay, this feeling is not isolated to me. And then along with it, keep doing the exposures, and add to that exposure. Maybe I really do like these thoughts. And just keep with it as you go through that backdoor spike, as you push through it. And it's tricky. It's really tricky. It's super uncomfortable. It makes you question whether you should have done ERP, right? But I just encourage you to stick with the exposures you're already doing. And let's see, backdoor spike, anxious about not being anxious. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. It's you're like, why don't I feel more worried than I used to feel so anxious before. Now I've done exposures. I no longer feel anxious, but maybe this is how I'm supposed to feel. Like maybe this is my default. And so yeah, just I'd encourage you to stick with the exposures, have tons of self-compassion, recognize a lot of us go through it, but stick with it. Let's see. How many other people get caught up doing compulsions over and over and just get worse before it gets better? It's very debilitating and has to do with more than one theme by the time it's over. So one thing to keep in mind is that OCD is OCD, regardless of the theme, right? And so it can feel really frustrating when your OCD is switching themes like that. Um, like when you have, you're thinking about existential OCD and then suddenly it shifts to the scrupulosity OCD and then suddenly to the relationship OCD. It can feel like three separate problems, right? And you can feel overwhelmed and just like, oh my gosh, like I'm a mess. I have all these three different like themes all coming at me all at once. And oh my gosh, it's OCD. It's one thing. And so I think it's really helpful to recognize that. And then when you're in that state of doing compulsions over and over again, it's really cool, Corey, that you can recognize that you go into that state, because one of the best things you can do there is have the awareness, say that like, okay, I'm in this cycle where I'm just doing compulsions over and over again, that they're getting worse and I'm spiraling. That's a really great time to look at the false alarm model, which if you don't know what that looks like, we have this fear over here. And so we have the urge to do the compulsion, we do the compulsion, and then that reconfirms that this is a fear we need to be scared of. And so when the first caveman who ever existed, right? He saw a bear and he was like, oh my gosh, that's so cute. This is the cutest little animal. And then he saw the bear eat his friend. And he was like, okay, no, bears are scary. So the next time he sees a bear, his brain goes, run away, and he runs super fast, right? He doesn't have to think about it really. His brain's just like, bears are scary, now you run. Then the next time he sees a bear, it's even quicker. He's like, he doesn't even have to think bears are scary, now you run. He just runs, right? The next time he runs even faster until he's so good at running away from bears. But with OCD, it's not a bear you're running away from. It might be a butterfly. And so this cycle is the same though. It's the same cycle the caveman went through when he first saw a bear. And so one thing that's really helpful is recognizing where you're at in that cycle. So recognizing I'm having this fear, and then, okay, now I have the urge to do this compulsion. Okay, now I'm doing this compulsion. Okay, now I have this fear. And I would sketch out that cycle. And as I was going through my brain and I was doing this, whenever I felt like I was spiraling, I would trace my finger along each stage so I could recognize where I was. And then the goal is to stop yourself in between the urge to do the compulsion and actually doing the compulsion. That's what ERP is. You're trying to stop your brain from, being reassured that the fear was right in the first place. And so you don't do the compulsion, and then the cycle doesn't keep going because you stopped. And so it's really helpful if you literally sketch that out and are doing here's my fear, here's my urge, here's the compulsion, here's my fear. Even if you're just writing the fears as they come up, I think that's a really good way to stop that spiraling that you're talking about. Let's see. I've seen, so a couple of these I want a little bit more context on. Elizabeth and Emily, if you want to explain a little bit more, like Emily, what do you mean when you say going out in public count as an exposure? Anything counts as an exposure when it's pushing you toward your fear. So if you had a fear of being in public for an OCD theme, then yeah, going out in public could be an exposure. It's anything that is stopping that cycle. It's anything that's pushing you toward that original fear that, is teaching you, it teaches your OCD that maybe that fear isn't as valid as you've been giving it credit for. Can you help with mental health anxiety? Like, have you ever gone through worrying about other disorders? Maybe, I maybe need a little bit more context on that too. Okay, Emily, you're talking about going outside in terms of HOCD or POCD. Definitely can be. If you're avoiding going outside because of those two themes, then yeah, going outside can be a really great exposure. Exposures can be anything, and they can even be things that other people would find normal everyday activities, like going outside, right? But if you're avoiding it, then it's a really great opportunity for it to become an exposure. How do you handle being suspicious that other people don't believe you? That one also maybe a little bit more context. Are you talking about when they don't believe your diagnosis or just when they don't believe you in general? I think that suspicion is another thing, another form of distress that you can sit with. Maybe they don't, right? Like sitting with that idea, sitting with that distress can be an exposure in and of itself. Nathan Peterson's here. We love him. If you guys need a good channel to learn about OCD, Nathan's channel is incredible. Let's see. Oh, talking about worrying about rare disorders that are extreme or getting rare disorders that are extreme. Yeah, that's a really common thing that OCD can grab onto. It can grab onto physical disorders. That's often a fear of the contamination OCD, right? You have this fear of touching this thing and then developing whatever disorder. But people can also have that fear in terms of mental health disorders, getting something that they deem as worse for whatever situation they're in. Or just the idea of being misdiagnosed can also be really scary. And those are definitely things OCD can grab onto, and you can do exposures with both of those. So the contamination OCD, you can do physical exposures, touching that doorknob, touching a Q-tip to the doorknob and then touching it to your hand, sitting with that, and then maybe touching the doorknob and then waiting 10 minutes before you wash your hands and then touching it and holding onto it. You know what I mean? You can build up toward those things, and you can do the same thing with when it's a rare mental health disorder. You can read more about that disorder as an exposure. You can read or watch videos of people who have been misdiagnosed, or there's so many creative exposures. Again, exposures are just any way to push you closer to your threat, because that helps that little OCD cycle. It helps your OCD recognize that maybe there isn't as much weight to these fears as they would like to believe. Let's see. I have intrusive thoughts that people are lying about understanding my POCD, or that they will hate me one day, or that my school counselors told everyone in the school about my intrusive thoughts. That's really hard. Those are really heavy fears, and also I think really normal. I think a lot of us have fears like that, that we'll be misunderstood, that no one will understand when we try to explain ourselves, especially with POCD and some of those themes that are a little taboo. But I think you're doing it. I think you're leaning into that uncertainty by still confiding in that school counselor, and um, sitting with the idea that maybe people are lying about understanding your POCD, but we can't read their thoughts, right? We can't figure out any certainty either way. We can just go with what they've told us and take the risk. Um, let's see what other ones I'm missing. You guys have such good questions, you guys. Um, Elizabeth says, it does help, I think, to embrace the anxiety rather than to want to run from it. Yeah. And, it's okay if you want to run from it, just don't run, right? We're allowed to have the urge to do the compulsion. We just don't follow through with the compulsion. So yeah, it's so helpful to lean into that anxiety, lean into the distress, whether it's anxiety or disgust or general fear, or just, not feeling exactly right. It's not just right. Whatever that distress looks like for you, leaning into it. Let's see. Does real event or false event tend to be present when dealing with any subtype of OCD? Totally depends on the person. Totally depends. But yeah, that is one that can often be comorbid. It can often grab onto your other forms of OCD. So if you had POCD, you might have like you might be questioning real events in your past and whether that fell under pedophilia or whether that was a normal thing you did. If you have relationship OCD, you might be thinking a lot about past breakups. If you have scrupulosity OCD, you might be thinking about times where you feel like you sinned, right? That can definitely come into play in any of those themes. And for some people, it doesn't at all. Maybe their OCD is purely based in the future, and or even just in the present. Maybe it doesn't even have to do with any events. It just is like about the feeling. Like just right OCD might not have anything to do with future events or past events. It might just have to do with this present feeling of distress. Have you ever experienced OCD having to do with bugs? For example, I often can't drink out of cups of water or water bottles because I won't be able to see if there's a bug inside. So yeah, that would often fall under, the contamination OCD might be one that could fall under. But definitely, yeah, I used to always worry about there being bugs in my drink or in my food, and I'd often have a hard time if I couldn't see my drink. Like if I was outside at a party at night and I couldn't see it, I would often worry about bugs. And that's another really awesome one to do exposures with, because the exposures right there are pretty easy. It's, or not easy, but easy to identify. It's going and drinking out of a cup when you can't see the inside, maybe grabbing a water bottle that isn't, if so that water bottle, you say your clear water bottle, you couldn't tell if there was a stink bug, going and drinking out of it anyway, and trying to step toward it, sitting outside where there's more bugs and things like that, could be really good compulsions exposures. I was reading this comment that says, when I want to do a compulsion and feel like I better do it because the thought or whatever happened in my mind might not be OCD. Is that common? Yeah. So OCD is so tricky. And oftentimes when we have that feeling we want to do a compulsion, we might be worried like, okay, maybe this isn't actually wanting to do a compulsion. Maybe I just want to do this thing. For instance, I used to do a compulsion where I had to put on makeup every day. I felt like that was like something I had to do. And so for a while, every time I put on makeup, I was like, oh my gosh, am I doing a compulsion, right? I wasn't sure whether I was or whether I wasn't. And so what you do in that case is you take the risk. And that meant some days I wore makeup and sometimes I didn't. Um, and, kind of we talked about this a little bit earlier, but if you sit and try to dissect what's OCD and what isn't, you kind of just get stuck in that pattern of OCD thinking. And so that's a great time just to take the risk. Maybe it is a compulsion. Maybe it's not. Um, yeah, but if your brain is telling you maybe you'd better do it because the thought or whatever happened might not be OCD. Often those terms like might not or maybe I should do it are indications that maybe that's an OCD thought in and of itself. So yeah, lean into that uncertainty. Is it still OCD if the intrusive thoughts don't fit a certain theme? I feel like my brain grabs onto anything I'm doing in the moment and creates an intrusive thought. That's OCD. The whole reason we have those different themes is simply because it helps people have something to identify with so they can find other people who also identify with it. If my OCD is grabbing onto a relationship, it's nice to say I have relationship OCD because then I can find other people who are also dealing with that form of thoughts. But OCD does not have to grab onto any of those individual themes, right? It can just grab onto life. You don't have to identify with any of those subtypes or themes. They're just helpful terms we use in the community. But all OCD is obsessions, things we think about a lot, and then compulsions, things we do to get away from the distress of our obsessions. That's it. It could be about anything. And typically it's just about the things that you're dealing with in life right then. And so you don't have to identify with any of these individual themes. But if it helps you to, then do. If it helps you to go to a group that's specifically for a certain theme, so you can meet other people dealing with that specific genre of intrusive thoughts, then do. But there's no pressure either way. Again, it's all OCD. Let's see. One spring, my OCD kicked in terribly when some tree frogs jumped into our swimming pool and laid eggs. Oh my gosh. I would not clean out the water for summer until all the eggs hatched. I didn't want to kill any of them. Oh my goodness. Oh, that's so funny. That you had a bunch of tree frogs in your swimming pool. That's tricky. It's so hard when OCD is grabbing onto things like that when you're like, no, I actually really don't want to hurt these frogs. But at the same time, I'm avoiding it out of fear. Those real life scenarios are often really, really hard. Um, yeah, those are tricky ones. Let's see. Yeah, a lot of you guys are just sharing some of the struggles that you're going through like that. Some of those individual instances that you've dealt with because of your OCD. And it's tricky. I just want to validate for all of you how tricky it is and how real these things that you're talking about are, how hard it is to feel that much responsibility for the world around you and for your own uncertainty. And yeah, I'm so grateful you guys all are here and talking about it. I think that's incredible, and I have so much esteem for you because it is hard. Um, okay, yeah. So NoCD is saying in the group that I'm going to be adding 10 new support groups starting tonight. So yes, definitely tune in. We're adding 10 new support groups. The first one is tonight at 9 p.m. CST, and then we're doing another one Thursday, and then we'll do some more next week and the week after that. So make sure you tune in. The one tonight, again, is mental compulsions and pure OCD, or pure O, as a lot of people call it. So definitely tune in. Yeah. Yeah, there's just a lot of people in the chat just expressing the difficulty that they're having. Um, and I'm so grateful for this community that NoCD's created where we can come and support each other and validate that it's hard, right? Oh yay, Ella's coming to the support group tonight. Yeah, it's hard and that this community is super validating, and I'm so glad that all of you are here today to talk about it. Looks like we have a few more questions. I think we usually go for around an hour. We have maybe 5 more minutes left. Does anyone have any last minute questions? Okay, how do we go to the support group tonight? Okay, great question. You can go on the NoCD app if you haven't downloaded it yet. It's a really incredible resource, and you can just hop right on and they have on the very first page this area where you can click through and go sign up for groups. You can also just Google no CD support groups and the page will go up. And yep, they're saying it right there in the chat as well. But it is on the first page of the app that you can go and click right through and then sign up for whatever groups you're interested in. Oh, perfect. They're going to be posting the link right there, which is super helpful. But there's so many incredible groups for whatever it is you're dealing with. If you have, I'm excited to. Are you excited to do your support group, Tia? I am. I think it's going to be really fun. I'm super excited. I'm so grateful for this really fun community. I love meeting other people who have gone through OCD or going through OCD. It's just such a validating and empowering community, and I'm so grateful to be part of it. So yeah, definitely sign up for the support groups. Like they said, I'm adding in 10, but there's so many others too. Just about all sorts of different things. There's some about, creativity in OCD where you all do a craft together and just kind of hang out, with other people who are going through something you're going through too. And there's some that are specific for individual subtypes. One for like moms who have OCD. There's just a whole lot of really incredible ones. And yes, in the chat is the link if you want to just join in the first group that we're doing tonight at 9 p.m. CST. We'd love to have you again, mental compulsions. And yeah, thank you guys for having me. Sorry it was a little chaotic. We've been running around. I've been running around all day long. Like I said, I had to get my ribs relocated right before this, and so I'm just a little scatterbrained, but I'm so grateful you guys tuned in. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you again in the future. Make sure you are, taking advantage of this app because it's so incredible. They have so many awesome initiatives and things, and it's free. The support groups tonight are free. So make sure you're taking advantage of those things because they're pretty awesome. Okay, thank you guys. I will see you later. Bye.